Have you ever heard someone say, Puerto Ricans are Taínos, or Puerto Ricans are Spaniard, or maybe Puerto Ricans are African? The truth is far more fascinating because Puerto Ricans are not descended from just one people. We're the product of centuries of migration, of explorers, farmers, soldiers, slaves, refugees, merchants, and families who crossed oceans looking for a better life. So some of our ancestors arrived over 500 years ago. Others came barely 200 years ago. Some came voluntarily. Others never had a choice. And many Puerto Rican families, including my own and my wife's, can still trace exactly where those ancestors came from. So, where do Puerto Ricans really come from? Today, we're going to answer that question. And get your glass ready because we're having a really good whiskey. Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Chronicles and Cocktails. I'm Josue, the spirited historian. If this is your first time here, every Sunday we travel through history, culture, genealogy, food, and the stories that made Puerto Rico and the world what they are today. Before we begin, thank you to every single one of you who keeps watching, subscribing, commenting, and supporting this channel. We're now getting incredibly close to something very special. Episode 100. I honestly can't believe we're almost there. I mean, really. And it almost marks an entire year of Chronicles and Cocktails. So I'd like your help. How should we celebrate? Should episode 100 be a huge documentary? Should we do a live episode? A live Q&A? Maybe even a conference somewhere in Puerto Rico? Or in the States? Leave your ideas in the comments. I genuinely love to hear them. And if you're not subscribed yet, this would be a great time to do it. It really helps the channel. Now, get comfortable because this one's going to be a really good one. Before there was Puerto Rico, there was Borikén. Long before Cristobal Colón, the island was inhabited by the Taino people. They belonged to the larger Arawakan cultural world and had migrated into the Caribbean generations before European contact. By the time Cristobal Colón arrived in November of 1493, the Taíno had established villages throughout the island. They farmed, fished, traded, and governed themselves under local caciques. For them, this wasn't a new world. It was simply home. On his second voyage, Cristobal Colón reached the island, renaming Borikén San Juan Bautista. That voyage changed Puerto Rico forever. Not because millions of Spaniards suddenly arrived. They didn't, in fact. Very few people living in Puerto Rico today descend directly from those first ships. That surprises many people. But history and genealogy are not always the same thing. Permanent Spanish colonization began in 1508 when Juan Ponce de León established Caparra. The island needed labor. Gold had been discovered. Farms needed workers. Construction had begun. The Spanish crown established settlements. But very quickly, the island faced its first great tragedy. The Taino population collapsed. To deceased, forced labor, starvation, war. Within only a few decades, the indigenous population had declined dramatically. By 1520, The Spanish crown officially emancipated the remaining Taino population. But by then, their numbers had already been devastated. Here's something many people don't realize. Puerto Rico wasn't heavily populated. Far from it. Historians estimate the island contained only somewhere between roughly 3,000 and 7,000 residents. That includes Europeans, Taínos, and Africans, an incredibly small population, and that helps explain something fascinating. Why today, almost everyone in Puerto Rico is related to everyone else if you go back far enough. That's not politics. That's not identity. That's population genetics. It's science. The dramatic decline of the Taíno population created an enormous labor shortage. Spain looked elsewhere. The answer was Africa. The Portuguese slave trade. Enslaved Africans began arriving in Puerto Rico during the early years of colonization. Unlike the Europeans who came seeking opportunity, these men, at first, and eventually women and children, they had no choice. They were forced across the Atlantic, separated from their families, sold into slavery, and made to work in Puerto Rico's growing economy. Something else that surprises many people. Puerto Rico actually received fewer enslaved Africans during the first centuries than islands like Cuba or Saint Domingue, today's Haiti. Why? Because Puerto Rico was still a relatively poor province. Spain focused much of its wealth elsewhere. Puerto Rico simply did not yet have the enormous sugar economy that developed in other Caribbean territories. Even so, African communities became firmly established around San Juan and other eastern coastal settlements like Loíza, Fajardo, Humacao, creating lasting Afro-Creole communities whose influence can still be seen throughout Puerto Rico today. As the centuries progressed, more Africans arrived, especially during the 19th century when the sugar economy expanded dramatically. Slavery would not finally be abolished in Puerto Rico until 1873. Today, African ancestry remains one of the three principal genetic components found throughout Puerto Rico. But it is only one chapter of a much bigger story. This is probably one of the biggest misconceptions people have. Many assume that if you're Puerto Rican, your Spanish ancestry must go all the way back to the first conquistadors. Actually, for most people, that's simply not true. Yes, some Puerto Rican families can trace themselves all the way back to the 16th century, but those families are relatively uncommon. Most Puerto Ricans descend from immigration waves that came much later, hundreds of years later, and that's exactly what we're about to see. Although people from the Canary Islands have been arriving since the time of Cristobal Colón, the first major organized migration happened much later, beginning in the late 17th century and especially throughout the 18th century. The Spanish crown actively encouraged Canarian families to settle in Puerto Rico. Why? The answer was simple. Spain wanted strength in its Caribbean possessions. Puerto Rico had too few inhabitants. It needed loyal settlers, farmers, families, people who would cultivate the island, establish towns, and help defend the island. This organized migration became known as the Tributo de Sangre, or the Blood Tribute, and we've talked about this before on our episode about the Canary Islands. So, under these policies, Canarian families crossed the Atlantic and permanently settled Puerto Rico. Unlike many of the first Spaniards, these immigrants weren't conquistadores. They were farmers. They cleared the land, raised livestock, cultivated crops, built communities. Many of the towns that define northern and western Puerto Rico owe much of their early development to these Canarian settlers. Their influence survives everywhere. La agricultura, las tradiciones, y la cultura rural. Even the way many Puerto Ricans speak Spanish still reflects Canarian influence. This migration became one of the largest and most important in Puerto Rican history. For countless Puerto Rican families, their Spanish ancestry doesn't begin in 1508. It begins with these Canarian immigrants who arrived generations later. Understanding this changes the entire conversation. Puerto Rican genealogy isn't the story of one arrival. It's the story of continuous arrivals. Every generation, the island kept changing. And the next great migration would change Puerto Rico once again. By the early 19th century, Spain faced a new challenge. Most of its American territories were fighting for independence. Puerto Rico and Cuba had become critically important. Spain wanted both islands to prosper. It wanted loyal populations. It wanted economic growth. And it wanted to discourage foreign powers from threatening the Caribbean. So in 1815, the Spanish crown issued one of the most important immigration policies in Puerto Rican history: the Royal Decree of Graces. The decree opened Puerto Rico to Catholic immigrants willing to swear loyalty to the Spanish crown. Suddenly, Puerto Rico welcomed newcomers from across Europe, not just Spain, France, Corsica, Ireland, Germany, Italy, Portugal, and many others. These immigrants received opportunities to settle, farm, trade, and build new lives. Once again, Puerto Rico's family tree became larger, more diverse, more interconnected. And for many Puerto Rican families alive today, this is where their European story truly begins. If you ever wondered why Puerto Rico has so many French-sounding surnames, this is why. French immigration did not happen all at once. It happened in several waves. The first French people to appear in Puerto Rico weren't settlers at all. They were corsairs, privateers. Some attacked Spanish settlements during the 16th century. One of the best-known attacks occurred in 1528, when French pirates sacked and burned the town of San Germán. But eventually, the French would come for a very different reason. Not to attack Puerto Rico, but to make it their home. Some French families arrived from Louisiana. Others fled the turmoil of Europe. But the largest wave came from the Caribbean itself. The Haitian Revolution completely transformed the Caribbean. Thousands of French colonists fled Saint-Domingue. Many sought refuge in nearby Puerto Rico. They brought knowledge, capital, agricultural experience. Many settled in western Puerto Rico, especially around Mayagüez and San Germán, where they helped expand sugar production. Others settled throughout the southwest part of the island. The Royal Decree of Graces of 1815 accelerated that migration even further. French and Corsican families continued arriving, many establishing coffee plantations in the mountains. Others entered commerce. Others became professionals. Their descendants remain throughout Puerto Rico today. If your last name is Franceschi, Pietri, Tardi, Masol, Matei, Negroni, or probably Negron, or many others, there's a good chance your family story passes through this chapter of Puerto Rican history. This chapter is actually very personal for me. One of my wife's great-great-great-grandfathers arrived directly from La Rochelle, France, during the 19th century. He eventually settled in the southwest of Puerto Rico, first around Sabana Grande and later Guanica, and from there his descendants spread throughout southern Puerto Rico and even into the Dominican Republic. Genealogy allows us to reconstruct stories like this with remarkable precision. You know, sometimes one passenger list, one marriage record, or one baptism changes everything you thought you knew about your family's past. Many people think that all Spanish immigration happened during the 16th century. Again, it didn't. In fact, one of the largest waves of Spanish immigration happened much later, during the 19th century. Thousands of Spanish continued arriving long after Puerto Rico became part of Spain for 300 years. They came from all over Spain: Galicians, Asturians, Basques, Catalans, Mallorcans, Andalusians. Canarians continued arriving as well. Many became merchants. Others entered government. Others established farms, coffee haciendas, sugar plantations, businesses, entire communities. These later arrivals dramatically reshaped Puerto Rico. For many Puerto Rican families today, their Spanish ancestors arrived during this 19th century migration, not during the time of Cristobal Colon and not during the conquest of Juan Ponce de León. By now, Puerto Rico had become something very different from the island Cristobal Colon first encountered. Generation after generation, new people kept arriving, not replacing earlier populations, but becoming part of them. Every wave added another branch to Puerto Rico's family tree. Another group that often surprises people is the Irish. Irish immigration to Puerto Rico stretches back centuries. Many came while serving the Spanish crown. Others arrived later as merchants and landowners, professionals, and immigrants encouraged by Spain's immigration policies. Some became enormously influential. Military leader Alejandro O'Reilly reorganized Puerto Rico's defenses. Sebastián de Morphy founded Utuado in 1739, and he left hundreds of descendants throughout Puerto Rico, me being one of them. Other Irish families entered agriculture, commerce, and public life. They integrated into Puerto Rican society, married local families, raised children, became part of the island. Today, Irish surnames continue to appear throughout Puerto Rico. Names like Murphy, O'Neill, Quill, and many others remind us that Puerto Rico's history is far more international than many people imagined. Now, this is where things usually become controversial. Not because the science is controversial, but because emotions sometimes are. A few episodes ago, someone left me a comment saying, "We're not Spanish, we're Taino." I politely explained that modern DNA studies simply do not support that conclusion for the vast majority of Puerto Ricans. The person argued back, so I asked, "Have you taken a DNA test?" The answer was, "I don't need one, I feel Taino." Well, Pepito, there are people out there who feel their chickens. Others feel their cats, dogs, or cows. That doesn't make them chickens, cats, dogs, or cows, right? History, genealogy, and genetics don't work based on feelings. They work based on evidence. Science doesn't ask us how we feel. Science asks us, what do the evidence and data show? Now, I'm not telling you not to have feelings. Of course, we all have feelings. And we're Puerto Rican proud. Of course, we are. The same thing happened when I explained that there is no Boricua de pura cepa, because we're not pura cepa anything. We're just a mix. a mix of a lot of things. And science proves that. All that mixture made Boricuas what we are today. And actually, it's still changing, it's still evolving. And we'll see that later in the episode. But hear me out before you overreact. This is not about feelings. You want to know who you are? Well, that's what we're doing here. And at the end, we decide who do we want to become, right? But this is the truth, and it is fact-based. Modern genetic studies consistently show that Puerto Ricans are tri-hybrid population: European, African, Native American. Virtually every Puerto Rican carries some combination of those three ancestral groups. The averages vary from individual to individual, but for Native American, primarily Taíno ancestry, many studies place the average roughly between 12 and 16%. Some people have less, some people, like me, have more, but very few have dramatically more than that. That doesn't diminish the importance of the Taíno. Quite the opposite. It simply tells us what actually happened. Okay, the people who built Puerto Rico came from multiple continents over multiple centuries, and that's exactly what our DNA reflects. One of the most fascinating discoveries concerns maternal ancestry. Most Puerto Rican maternal indigenous ancestry comes through Taino women. Spanish colonization during the early years consisted largely of European men. Those men frequently married or formed families with Taino women. As generations passed, their descendants continued marrying newcomers from Europe and later with Africans and other immigrant populations. That's one reason why mitochondrial DNA studies often reveal remarkably strong indigenous maternal lineages, even though overall indigenous ancestry represents a much smaller percentage of the total genome. In other words, your mother's 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 mother may very well have been Taino, even if your overall ancestry today is predominantly European. Science allows us to see both stories at the same time. Modern genetic research has also found that ancestry varies geographically. European ancestry tends to be higher in some of western and central regions of the island. African ancestry is generally higher along parts of the eastern coast, a pattern strongly influenced by the historical location of sugar plantations and the colonial slave economy. Native American ancestry, however, is remarkably consistent throughout the island. Again, history, geography, and genetics all tell the same story. Even after all these migrations, Puerto Rico's story wasn't finished. People continued arriving: French, Corsican, Irish, Spaniards from every region, Germans, Italians, Portuguese, Lebanese, others from Europe, and let me tell you something. Movement from Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico exists since the Cristobal Colon days. During those years, moving to and from Santo Domingo was like moving to and from New York today. We are the same. Similar thing with Cuba and other Spanish American territories. Each family adding another branch to Puerto Rico's growing family tree. By the end of the 19th century, Puerto Rico's population had grown from only a few thousand people during the early colonial years to nearly 1 million inhabitants. The Puerto Rican people, as we know them today, had taken shape. Then history changed once again. In 1898, Puerto Rico became part of the United States. In 1917, Puerto Ricans became American citizens under the Jones-Shrafford Act. go check our episode on American citizenship. That decision transformed Puerto Rican migration forever. Unlike immigrants from other countries, Puerto Ricans could move freely between the island and the mainland. No visas, no naturalization process, no immigration papers. Just movement within the same nation. After World War II, hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans left the island, looking for opportunity, jobs, education, a different future. Some stayed, others returned. Many raised families in both places, creating something unique. A Puerto Rican family that spans the Caribbean and the American mainland. And that story continues today. Okay, it's time for the cocktail. This is where I usually make an actual cocktail. And a cocktail is different from a drink or a beer. It requires 2 or more ingredients. But not today. Today, we're doing something simpler. And we're just tasting some whiskey. Puerto Rican whiskey. This whiskey I chose for a reason. A handcrafted blended whiskey made in Carolina, Puerto Rico. And if you've been watching our episodes, you know this is a favorite of mine. And it really is a favorite of mine. Ever since I tasted it a few months ago, I think it was in Calle. It's incredibly smooth, with notes of sugarcane, almonds, and spices. And it's finished with port wine. Now, I could have made an old-fashioned, which I have in the past, and I could have done a boulevardier, which I've also have made with this whiskey, and it's truly spectacular. But in this case, and for today's episode, I didn't want to hide it behind bitters. No. Or vermouth or orange, because the flavor of this whiskey is really outstanding. But the real reason I chose this whiskey, now, that is truly spectacular. And it has nothing to do with the tasting notes, but it has to do with its name. On the label, the makers explain that in the indigenous Taíno language of the Caribbean, buca means you are. I mean, think about that for a second. Buca in Taíno means you are. I mean, what are we exploring in this episode today? Today's episode asks, where do Puerto Ricans come from? And this bottle answers, you are. I mean, honestly, it's almost like this whiskey was made specifically for this episode. And you know what? I'm not promoting it. I'm not getting paid for this. I did actually try to find them to see if they wanted to partner with Chronicles and Cocktails. I tell you that because I wanted them to partner with this. I mean, it would have been a perfect match. However, I do like it. And I usually show you things that I do really like. Whether they become partners or not, or sponsorships, well, that could very well happen, and I wish it does. However, not at this moment. The back of the label says, since ancient times, from European landings to the great African diaspora and beyond, the definition of who you are has grown. At Buca, we honor this diverse legacy by inviting our communities to toast and celebrate what matters most. And then it says, you are Caribbean. I mean, seriously, how could I not use this whiskey for this episode? And you know, I pair cocktails and drinks with the episode, the history, the culture. It's not drinking for drinking. We're past that. We're intelligent people in this channel, right? You are, we are, and that's all there is to it. But how can you not celebrate your heritage with a whiskey that actually honors that heritage? But You know me, I do my research, and to be fair, I have to tell you what I found. It turns out that the word buka has different meanings around the world. There's an island named Buka in Papua New Guinea. There's also a town with the same name. In Nigeria, buka refers to a traditional pepper stew. In the Shona language of Zimbabwe, it refers to a sudden violent startled or convulsion. In Indonesian and Malay, buka simply means to open. Among the Noongar people of Australia, a buka is a traditional kangaroo skin cloak. It's also the name of a communication software and even a Russian video game publisher. How about that? Funny how one word has different meanings around the world. The aromas of the port wine come directly to you. And that sugar cane and corn, it feels right on the nose. You know, corn is an indigenous American cereal, right? The Taínos and many American indigenous people cultivated corn all throughout North America, the Caribbean, the main continent, and what it is known today as Central America, right? So, yeah, it's almost like a bourbon type of whiskey. So, where do Puerto Ricans come from? The answer isn't simple, and that's exactly what makes it so fascinating. Puerto Ricans don't descend from one ship, or one expedition, or one race, or one culture, or one moment in history. We descend from wave after wave after wave of people. We descend from the indigenous Taino people. Those maternal lines remain present in so many Puerto Rican families today. From Spaniards, who began arriving in the early 16th century and then continued arriving for another 400 years. From Africans, whose forced migration forever transformed Puerto Rico's culture, from music and language to food and family history. From Canarian farmers, who settled towns across the island, from French refugees escaping revolution. Last episode was about the connection of East Canada and Puerto Rico. If you haven't watched it, go see it. And a few episodes before that, the Santo Domingo connection. And a few weeks back, we had the Irish connection. And before that, the Tordesillas. And before that, the New Orleans connection. I mean, we have to realize Puerto Ricans are not here from just one single arrival. From Corsican coffee growers, from Irish soldiers, from Galicians, Asturians, Basques, Catalans, Mallorcans, Portuguese, Germans, Italians, Lebanese, Dominicans, Americans, and many others, who all became Puerto Rican. That's why there isn't one Puerto Rican face, one Puerto Rican surname, one Puerto Rican story. There are millions connected, intertwined, and remarkably related. Because when an island begins with only a few thousand inhabitants and grows generation after generation through immigration, intermarriage, and shared history, family trees begin crossing everywhere. Eventually, almost everyone becomes everyone's cousin somewhere. We know that. You've seen it on Ancestry. And honestly, I think that's beautiful. Not because it proves anyone right politically, not because it supports one ideology over another, but because it's true. History doesn't belong to one group. Genealogy doesn't belong to one narrative. Science doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about emotions. It simply follows the evidence. And the evidence tells us that Puerto Rico became what it is today through centuries of migration. That's something worth celebrating. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give it a like, subscribe if you haven't already, share it with someone who has always wondered where Puerto Ricans really come from. And I'd love to hear your own family story. Where did your ancestors come from? Can you trace them to Spain, the Canary Islands, France, Ireland, Corsica, Africa, or somewhere else entirely? Leave it in the comments. I read far more of them than you probably think. And remember, episode 100 is coming soon, so don't forget to tell me how you think we should celebrate it. You want a live show? A Q&A? A conference? Something completely different? The ideas are now in your hands. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next Sunday. Until then, be good, be nice, read a lot, do your own research, have fun, travel. It's Sunday, so you have to go to church. And of course, salud.